Okay, here we are. Two more chapters, chapter 5 and chapter 6. Chapter 5 is Grandma's Cakes. All around the house came the sound of children's voices. They were playing hide and seek, and everyone joined in. They raced in and out of the rooms, across the courtyard, up the stone steps, onto the roof, down again onto the veranda, and out into the garden. Their voices rose as they counted, yelled, giggled, snuffled, and shuffled in their hiding places, shushing each other up and stifling their laughter. Then there would be a brief silence while the seeker went seeking. Do you like to play hide and seek? It's fun, isn't it? Sasu was hiding her eyes and counting. Nitu looked unsure of where to hide, but Radha grabbed her arm and said, "Come with me, I'll show you a good place." Everyone scuttled off in all different directions. A wonderful warm smell was wafting through the house. It followed the children wherever they went. There was no hiding place where the delicious sweet aroma didn't reach and make them smack their lips with hunger. "What's that nice smell?" whispered Nitu as she crouched next to Radha in their hiding place behind the wardrobe. "Is today Friday?" asked Radha. "Then it's Grandma's baking day." I heard Sasu shouting, "Coming!" and saw her rush past. They heard her stop at the kitchen to see if anyone was hiding there and then carry on up to the roof. Radha and Nitu crept out. Sasu checked the kitchen and she won't come back. Let's see if Grandma needs help with her cakes. Grandma Chatterjee stood there with a large mixing bowl in her arms, stirring and stirring flour, butter, eggs, milk, sugar, nuts and raisins. Her oven was already hot and glowing with one batch of cakes. Now she began to spoon out her mixture onto a cupped tray for another batch of cakes. Radha and Nitu appeared at the doorway. "Can we help with the cakes?" asked Radha, coming up to the mixing bowl and dipping in a finger. "Arre! Don't go poking your fingers into my bowl," snapped Grandma sternly. "Aren't you meant to be hiding?" Nitu felt a little afraid of Grandma because she looked so fierce. She seemed to make the rules in the house and everyone obeyed her. Have you got one of those grandmas? That if she tells you to do something, you do it, don't you? Everyone obeys Grandma. Nitu, even Grandpa. Nitu shyly tugged Radha's hand and whispered, "We'd better go back to our hiding place before Sasu finds us." But Radha wasn't afraid. She circled Grandma, scooping up bits of cake mixture with her little finger. "Stop it, Radha," Grandma ordered, and smacked her granddaughter's hand. "She's such a naughty girl. Don't you think so, Nitu? She's as bad as the sparrows." Nitu thought they were being told off until she saw Grandma's light brown eyes, which could be as hard as walnuts, sparkling with friendliness. Grandma finished spooning out the mixture onto the tray and then, to her joy, offered them the bowl and the spoon to lick. Suddenly, a cluster of sparrows hurtled through the fretwork which crisscrossed through the open kitchen window. Chirruping excitedly in hectic play as they darted and dived among the kitchen shelves. "Arre! These sparrows! They're such a nuisance. They do potty all over the place. Grandpa wants to put a wire mesh all over the windows, but I won't let him. A wire mesh may stop the sparrows, but it would make my kitchen so hot in the summer that I would need to use my oven, but I wouldn't need to use my oven for baking. So what do I do?" sighed Grandma. The girls ducked as the sparrows zoomed around, weaving in and out of each other. Then they dived through the fretwork and out into the garden again. "Well, I suppose they are all God's creatures," murmured Grandma, "and they have as many rights as we do, so we'll let them be." There was still a lot of cake mixture left around the sides of the bowl when they heard footsteps coming. "Quick, Sasu's coming!" exclaimed Radha. "We'd better hide," and she dragged Nitu away back to their hiding place behind the wardrobe. But it wasn't Sasu, it was Sanjay who appeared at the doorway. His mouth was watering with the smell of the baking cakes. "Hello, Sanjay," said Grandma. "Aren't you meant to be hiding?" "I don't know a good place," complained Sanjay, his eyes on the bowl and the spoon, which was still thick with cake mixture. He slid a finger round the inside of the mixing bowl. "Are these cakes for us?" he asked, fervently sucking his finger. "Yes," said Grandma, taking one batch out of the oven and putting another in. Sanjay's hand stretched out hopefully, but Grandma flicked it away with a frown. No, Sanjay, these are for tea on Sunday. And she looked so severe that Sanjay didn't dare beg to let him have just one. But here, child, she said, with a sudden glinting smile, you can lick the spoon if you like. Sanjay eagerly snatched the spoon she offered and began to lick it all over, up the stem, round the neck, and he was just getting to the really thick bit on the head when suddenly Sasu appeared and grabbed him. I've caught Sanjay! Now it's his turn to hide his eyes. That's not fair, moaned Sanjay. I wasn't even hiding. Well, you should have been, cried Sasu unmercifully. The other children appeared flushed and laughing. They made Sanjay stand by the veranda pillar and hide his eyes. No peeping, Rahul warned him, and be sure to count to 100. Sanjay can't count to 100, scoffed Nithu. Oh, yes, I can, retorted Sanjay and began chanting loudly. 1, 2, 3. There's Grandma. Do you think she's really as severe as she makes out to be? I don't think so. I think she's quite gentle, isn't she? The children scattered. Sanjay did get stuck around 15, so he went back to the beginning and started again, getting quieter and quieter till he was murmuring softly and waiting a long enough time so that it would seem as though he had counted to 100. Then he yelled, Coming! Coming! Echoed Hello from the courtyard and burst out cackling. Sanjay wandered about from room to room. He looked under beds, behind chairs and sofas. He tugged at curtains in case someone was coiled up inside them and climbed up onto the roof to search amongst the washing lines flapping with clothes. But his heart really wasn't in it. He couldn't stop thinking about Grandma's cakes. He went back to the kitchen, but the bowl and the spoon had been cleared away. Grandma had finished her baking and had gone to wash her hair under the courtyard tap. He lingered, held by the rich warm smell, and wondered where Grandma had stored her cakes. He looked around, pretending he was hunting for the others. Perhaps someone was hiding under the table or in the cupboard. Suddenly he saw a movement from behind a far curtain. He dashed over and flung it aside. Caught you! He shouted triumphantly. Shh! It was Grandpa Chatterjee, looking extremely guilty with a cake clutched in his fingers. Behind the curtain was a small pantry, and standing in the corner was a metal chest. I was just checking to see if Grandma's cakes were up to her usual standard, he exclaimed with a smile, like a wicked robber. Go on, be off with you. There's no one hiding here, Grandpa Chatterjee drew aside the curtain and bustled Sanjay out of the kitchen. Now, I must get along to the post office, and Grandpa Chatterjee hurried away. Sanjay couldn't help himself. He went back into the kitchen. A sparrow flew through the window and darted behind the curtain into the pantry, and Sanjay followed. The sparrow chirruped on the ledge above the tin chest and cocked his head sideways, looking with an eager eye. A rich, warm, sugary smell hung in the air. Sanjay lifted the lid. There was a newly baked cake stored like gold. There were several layers, all lined up on their trays with clean white napkins in between. I wonder if Grandma's cakes are up to standard, said Sanjay to himself. He bent down and sniffed, and before he knew it, he had stuffed one cake into his mouth and swallowed it. That one seems to be up to standard, he murmured, brushing away the crumbs from his chin. The sparrow flew down quickly to peck as the large black ant peered out of the crack in the wall. I wonder if they are all as good as that. The sparrow spun in the air expectantly. Sanjay wriggled a hand down the side. There were many layers of cakes. Perhaps he should take one cake from each layer. He lifted out another. Puzzled voices were ringing round the house. Sanjay, come and find me! Gradually it began to dawn on those who were hiding that Sanjay wasn't looking for them. They came out, feeling annoyed. Sanjay, where are you? Shouted Rahul. If you don't play properly, we won't let you join our great games. But there was no sign of Sanjay. Now everyone was looking for him, inside and outside, and up on the roof and all around the garden. They even looked at the lane outside the house, calling and calling his name. The grown-ups were consulted. Have you seen Sanjay? They asked Grandma Chatterjee, who was drying her hair in the sun. Have you seen Sanjay? They asked Auntie Meena, who was shelling peas on the veranda. Have you seen Sanjay? They whispered to Great-Grandma Chatterjee, but she was dozing and Hello called out, "Sanjay, naughty boy, naughty boy." Grandpa Chatterjee came walking back from the post office. "We lost Sanjay. Is he with you?" they asked. "No." Grandpa looked thoughtful. Suddenly, Grandma shouted, "Arre! Look at all those ants coming from my kitchen." A long trail of large, shining black ants came out of the kitchen, across the veranda, down the steps, and trooped into the garden. "Look, look, look! They're carrying something," exclaimed Auntie Mina. Everyone bent down to look. "Cake crumbs!" cried Grandma. "Has somebody been eating my cakes?" The sight of all those ants made Nithu's skin prickle, but she couldn't help but being fascinated by the busy, determined creatures moving to and fro in constant floor line as they shunted cake crumbs from one to another. "I hope they haven't got at Grandma's cakes," muttered Radha. Grandma Chatterjee looked accusingly at Grandpa Chatterjee. "Have you been at my cakes again?" she demanded sternly. She knew what a weakness Grandpa had for her cakes. Before Grandpa could reply, they all heard a faint whimpering. They hurried into the kitchen. The train of ants crossed the floor and disappeared behind the curtain. Radha ran over and flung the curtain aside, and Nithu gave a shriek of horror. There stood Sanjay on top of the tin chest with a cake in each hand. Crumbs and tears dripped from his cheeks. He was surrounded by a vast sea of black ants. Silly India, he whimpered. Grandpa Chatterjee plunged through the swarming creatures and held up his arms. Sanjay leapt into them gratefully, whispering, I'm sorry, I'm really sorry." "Oh, Sanjay," cried Nithu, "you naughty boy. You've been stealing Grandma's cakes." "Don't blame Sanjay," Grandma said sternly. "He learned it from someone who should have known better," and she wagged her finger at Grandpa Chatterjee. "No cakes for you this week," she said. Grandpa Chatterjee bowed his head. "Sorry." "Sorry," squawked Hello solemnly. The children all burst out laughing. Sanjay had such a good hiding place that no one would have found him if it wasn't for the ants. They shouted like a flock of sparrows and rushed off again to play. Grandpa beckoned Sanjay and whispered in his ear, "In India, food is very precious. Nothing goes to waste. So if you drop one crumb, there is always a pig, a dog, a monkey, a cockroach, a sparrow, or an ant to come and eat it up. So next time be sure not to drop a single crumb." Sanjay nodded, then whispered back, "Grandpa, can you show me another good hiding place?" Chapter 6, last chapter. "Before you go home to England, you must bathe in the river. Today we are going to take Great Grandma Chatterjee for her bathing, so you can go too," said Grandpa Chatterjee. Nithu and Sanjay were amazed. Why, Great Grandma even had to be helped by the pump in the courtyard. How could she want to go to the river to bathe? But no one seemed surprised. Great Grandma liked to go in a horse-drawn carriage. So that afternoon Uncle Ashok set off to find one. Soon he returned and came trotting up to the gates in a carriage like the ones Nithu and Sanjay had seen in films or pictures of Victorian England. And it was called a Victoria. It was pulled by two smart horses, one brown, one white, with shiny leather and brass embossed harness, and each with a red feathered plume between its ears. The driver sat on a high seat at the front, and the reins dangling between the fingers of one hand, and a long whip in the other, with which to flick the horses into action. First, Auntie Mina and Uncle Ashok carefully helped Great Grandma onto the carriage and settled her in. Then Grandpa held open the carriage door like a footman, and Nithu and Sanjay climbed inside and sank back into the red leather seats. So that they had plenty of room, Uncle Ashok said he and Auntie Mina would follow them on the motor scooter. The horses set off, clip-clopping, their hooves echoing down the broad Calcutta streets. Nithu and Sanjay studied the old lady who sat before them, all wrapped up in her shawl. "Is Great Grandma really going to bathe in the river?" they asked in puzzled voices. "Oh yes," said Grandma Chatterjee. "The river has become the most important place in her life." They stared out of the carriage windows as the horses trotted out into the road and joined a human river, a river of people who swept through the huge city, pulling things, pushing things, carrying things on their backs and on their heads. There were those who were riding on bicycles, mopeds, in rickshaws or in trams and buses. It was a torrent of living creatures, amongst which wandered dogs and pigs and horses and cows, where birds swooped and flapped and squawked and soared over the rooftops with hundreds of fluttering paper kites. There's Great-Grandma getting into the carriage. Then Grandpa cried, "Look!" They saw huge curving girders of a bridge which stretched over the wide expanse of a shining water. It looked as though it had been built to carry the weight of the whole of mankind. When they had crossed the other side, they made their way along the river until they came to a place where many, many people had gathered. The sunlight danced on the water, sparkling and shimmering. All sorts of boats and crafts floated like dreams through the liquid haze. Men, women, children stood at the water's edge, their garments fluttering. They bent and scooped water into their hands and rubbed their arms and faces, and they walked further into the river and finally dipped themselves under completely. "This is where Great-Grandma likes to bathe," said Grandpa Chatterjee as the horses pulled up. Nithu and Sunday watched wonderingly as Uncle Ashok and Auntie Meena led Great-Grandma between them down to the water's edge. There she removed her shawl and her slippers, put everything in a neat pile, and let out her hair. Uncle Ashok and Auntie Meena did the same. Then, each with an arm round Great-Grandma to support her, they all entered the water and waded out until they stood waist deep. Garlands of marigolds and hollowed out coconut shells floated around them as they cupped their hands, scooped water over their heads, and drank and chanted prayers. "But why do they need to go into the river to pray?" asked Nithu. So Grandpa Chatterjee told them. Once, many thousands of years ago, when the world was still being created, this river only flowed in heaven, high up beyond the highest peaks of the Himalayan mountains. The river was really the goddess Ganga, and her waters were so holy that anyone who bathed in them would be cleansed of their sins and gain everlasting life. There was a king living on the earth at a time when the world had only just been created and things were very, very new. This king had 2 wives but no children, and he prayed devotedly to God, and at last he was rewarded with the birth of many sons. The king was so happy that he looked for the finest horse in the land to sacrifice to God in gratitude. At last he found the strongest, most beautiful, pure white horse and captured it, not realizing that it belonged to the Lord Indra. Before the horse could be sacrificed, Indra stole it back again. The king and his sons searched high and low for the horse, for they could not think that anything else that was good enough to offer the god. His sons even dug their way through to the centre of the earth looking for this horse. They dug so deep that the goddess of the earth cried out in pain, and her husband, Lord Vishnu, sent a terrible fire which burned the king's sons to death. The king was grief-stricken. He hadn't meant to offend anybody, and he begged God to bring his sons back to life. God told him, "Your sons will come back to life when the river Ganga flows to the earth." So now the king began years and years of praying and penance. At last God was moved and allowed the goddess Ganga to flow to the earth. The river eagerly gathered herself together in mighty torrent ready to plunge to earth. When Lord Shiva, the blue-throated one, the destroyer of evil, realized that the whole world would be destroyed by the river's force. As the heavens opened, he stood underneath, and the great cataract thundered down on his head. The great river was trapped in Shiva's tangled hair, and for a while wandered over his head looking for ways to escape. Finally he found 7 partings in his hair, and breaking herself up, she was at least released from Shiva's head and flowed to the earth, broken up into 7 rivers. The pure mountain waters of the river Ganga tumbled down, and with it came fish and turtles and porpoises and frogs and crocodiles and spray, which scattered like egrets. It was marvellous. Even the gods and the angels and the heavenly warriors glistened with jewels, were absolutely amazed by the sight. The rivers broke into streams and brooks and waterfalls and pools and tumbled merrily down on to the arid plains, soaking deep into the earth. Trickles of it came to the ashes of the king's sons, and the waters mingled with their ashes. Their souls came to life and ascended into heaven to live in happiness forever. So you see, explained Grandpa Chatterjee, the river is one of those rivers, and that is why people come to bathe here. They hope that when they die, their ashes will be put into the river so that their souls will go up to heaven. The children watched as Uncle Ashok and Auntie Meena helped Great Grandma to submerge herself completely into the water. Here, take these towels to them and set of dry clothes to change into, and you can bathe too if you wish, smiled Grandpa Chatterjee. We didn't bring a change of clothes, said Nithu in a disappointed voice. Oh, never mind, go and bathe, just take your shoes off, said Grandpa. Can we really go in with all our clothes on? Cried Nithu and Sanjay with delight. The sun is so hot that if you run up and down for half an hour, you'll soon be dry, said Grandpa. Nithu and Sanjay ran excitedly down to the water, but then both stopped before rushing in. They remembered Grandpa's story. There was no ordinary water. This was no ordinary water. This river was holy. Sanjay took Nithu's hand, and feeling suddenly solemn, they stepped into the silky water. Look, whispered Nithu, pointing towards the mid-river. A great turtle seemed to swim specially close so that they could see the shiny shell back, his delicate but powerful arms and feet, and his smooth, gentle head, and then he dived and disappeared from view. Grandpa Chatterjee watched his grandchildren with great contentment. He was glad that they had bathed in the waters of the Ganga before they were going back to England. And they saw a beautiful turtle. I hope you enjoyed that story as much as I enjoyed reading it to you, and maybe some of the experiences that these children from England had when they went to India, maybe some of the experiences that you had. Now, the very first time when I went to India, when I was 11, I remember going to the Golden Temple, and there's water there that people go and bathe in because that's holy water. And I remember doing that with my mum as well. And it was strange, but it was exciting, and it's sometimes difficult to understand why we do these things. But my mum explained it to me, and it was very similar to what we've heard here. And it was just the most wonderful experience when you dip into pretty cold water, really, but it gives you such an uplift and a wonderful feeling of just being alive and content with life. So I hope you've really enjoyed that, and I look forward to reading some more stories to you soon.